Before I start, I want to be really upfront about something. I am talking about PDA today as a mum, not as a PDA specialist, not someone who has PDA myself. And I want to be honest, I am really early in my PDA journey. The profile was only identified for my son this year, and I'm still researching, I'm still learning, I'm still getting things wrong, and I'm still adjusting. And I'm genuinely hoping that making this episode means that I'll hear from people who know more than I do, and that this community will teach me as much as I teach. And my son's experience is not a blueprint for every PDA child. Every profile is different, and every person who is PDA themselves will have their own experiences that may be completely different to what I described. If you ever want some proper guidance on this, the PDA Society is the place to go. Their resources are free. They are real experts. I'm just a mum who is at the very beginning of figuring it out. I want to tell you about something that happened this morning. I needed my children to brush their teeth, standard morning, standard routine, standard request, except one of my children. There is no such thing as a standard request and no such thing as just asking. So here's what I did instead. I called all three of their names, and I said out loud to no one in particular, I wonder what order they'll come up in. And I put him last in my guess, and I said his name last because I absolutely knew that if I said he would be last, he would be first. And he was. He came charging up those stairs, teeth brushed, for me, game one. But here's the big thing. He didn't brush his teeth because I asked him to. He brushed his teeth because he felt he outmaneuvered me, because he was in control of the outcome. Because in his world, the world of a PDA profile, control isn't a behavioural problem, it's a survival need. And the moment that I understood that, that's when everything changed. And today we're talking about the PDA profile, what it is, what it isn't, what the world keeps getting catastrophically wrong about it, and what actually helps. And this isn't the clinical version, this is the version from inside a family who is absolutely living it and genuinely still figuring it out every single day. And I want to say that because I hope that it matters. I am, as I said, really early in this. The PDA profile was only identified for my son this year. I am researching it as fast as my little ADHD brain will let me, and I will get things wrong. I'm hoping that by making this episode, I am going to be learning as much from you as anyone learns from me. So my middle child, he was described to me in so many ways before anyone used the words PDA profile. Stubborn, strong-willed, sometimes socially isolated, disruptive to others. And I want to sit with all of those words for a moment because I think a lot of parents listening will recognise them. They're words that get written in behaviour logs and mentioned in school meetings and said by well-meaning professionals who genuinely believe they are describing what they're seeing. And they're not wrong, and they're not just wrong about what they're seeing, they are catastrophically wrong about what it means. Because a stubborn child assumes that the child is choosing not to comply. Strong-willed assumes there's a will that could be directed differently if the right pressure were applied. Disruptive assumes that the child is doing something to others rather than something happening to the child. And none of these framings were right. And the approaches that came across with these framings, they were firm boundaries, consistent consequences, clear expectations. And you know what? They made things worse every single time. And that isn't because my child is broken. That is because those approaches were built for an entirely different brain. And we spent so long trying to use the tools before anyone even handed us the right ones. Before I go any further into our family's experience, I want to give you some context, because one of the most isolating things about navigating a PDA profile is the feeling that your child is uniquely difficult, they are uniquely misunderstood, uniquely falling through the gaps, that everyone else seems to be navigating just fine, and they're not. The data tells a very different story, and here's the honest starting point. We do not know exactly how many children in the UK have a PDA profile. There has only been one small prevalence study so far. The PDA Society, the only specialist PDA charity in the UK, acknowledges this gap openly. This is not a well-counted population, which in itself tells you something about how seriously this profile has been historically taken. But what we do know is this: over 70% of children with a PDA profile are not in school or struggle significantly with attendance. Not 70. That is nearly 3/4 of children with this profile are either not attending school at all or finding it profoundly difficult to manage. And we know that children with a PDA profile experience repeated school exclusions at rates significantly higher than their peers. Regular school refusal and repeated exclusions are in fact listed by the PDA Society's own practice guidance as key indicators that a PDA profile should be considered in the first place. So let's just let that land. The thing that gets a child suspended, the behaviour that looks like defiance, that gets described as oppositional, that triggers consequences and phone calls and meetings, and itself the thing that gets a child suspended, the behaviour that looks like defiance, that gets described as oppositional, that triggers consequences and phone calls and meetings, is itself one of the signals that a PDA profile might be present. The system is responding to the symptom instead of the underlying cause. PDA also lacks its own code in the main diagnostic manuals, the DSM-5 and ICD-11. It is not a standalone diagnosis. It's understood in the UK as a profile found within some autistic people, which means it can be identified during an autism assessment if the assessor knows what to look for and chooses to look for. But many don't, and so children get diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder or anxiety or nothing at all, and they keep being described as stubborn and strong-willed and defiant, and what actually happens is it goes unsupported. This is a system problem, not a child problem. And I want to say something about the name before we go any further, because it matters. PDA has traditionally stood for pathological demand avoidance, but more and more people within the community, including many PDA people themselves, prefer pervasive drive for autonomy. And I want to use that framing because it changes everything. Pathological puts the problem inside the child. Pervasive drive for autonomy describes the neurological need, and those two things are completely different. PDA, pervasive drive for autonomy, though you'll also hear it called pathological demand avoidance, sits within the autism spectrum. It is not about a child who is avoiding demands out of defiance or manipulation. It's about a child whose nervous system has an overwhelming neurological drive to be in control of their own life. The PDA profile sits within the autism spectrum, but it presents so differently from what most people think of as autism that it gets missed constantly, particularly in children who are verbal, socially engaged, imaginative and bright, which actually describes my son entirely. Because here's the thing that nobody tells you about PDA children. They are often incredibly socially motivated and they want connection, they want friendship, and they are often empathetic, imaginative, creative. They can read social situations in ways that might surprise you. And they can often fall apart completely when a demand, however small, however reasonable, however lovingly delivered, triggers that survival response. And that's the key word, it's survival. The child is not choosing to be difficult. This is a child whose nervous system experiences demands, even gentle ones, even ones they want to comply with, as a threat. And that takes something away out of their control. And when control feels threatened, the response is total. And that is not stubbornness. That is their nervous system doing exactly what it was built to do. So I want to spend some time on this because I think it's one of the most practical and useful things that I can share. PDA is not a diagnosis you can simply go out and get. There is no PDA test, no PDA clinic, no tick box assessment that produces a PDA result at the end. So what actually happens if things go well is that during an autism assessment, the assessor identifies a PDA profile and notes it in their report. That is the best case path, and it requires an assessor who knows what PDA looks like, who takes it seriously, and who chooses to explore it. Many assessors don't, and some local authorities don't accept PDA as a descriptor in an EHCP. Many don't. The recognition varies significantly across the country, which means that whether your child's PDA profile gets named and supported can depend on where you happen to live. Here is what one piece of PDA research put so well. On a bad day, a child with PDA can look oppositional. On a good day, they can look neurotypical. This chameleon quality is exactly what makes PDA so difficult to identify and so easy to respond to with the wrong strategies. So let me just say that again. A child who looks neurotypical on a good day, who looks oppositional on a bad day, who has no consistent presentation that a system built around consistent presentations can categorise. Of course, that gets missed. One of the most complicating factors is that PDA profile can be misidentified as other things entirely. In children, the most common misdiagnoses can include oppositional defiant disorder, anxiety, attachment disorders, and conduct disorders. In adults, particularly women, borderline personality disorder is a common misdiagnosis. And these aren't clinicians making lazy errors. These are clinicians working with the tools that they have in a system that hasn't quite caught up with the research. The critical distinction, the thing that separates PDA profile from other presentations, is what drives the avoidance. In most autistic children, demand avoidance is a response to identifiable triggers: sensory overload, disrupted routines, anxiety about a specific task. In PDA, the avoidance centers on the act being asked to do something, regardless of what the thing is, regardless on whether the child actually wants to do it. The demand itself, not its content, is the source of threat. That's why the standard toolkit, it doesn't work, because the standard toolkit addresses the content of the demand. And for a PDA child, the content is almost irrelevant. It's the demand that triggers the response. So if you suspect that your child may have a PDA profile, ask your GP for an autism assessment. And use the PDA Society's practice guidance. It's free, it's downloadable, and it gives assessors and parents the language they need. If your local NHS waiting list is over 18 weeks, you may also be eligible for the right to choose, a mechanism that allows you to access an NHS funded private assessment with a provider of your choice. Again, start with your GP. And in the meantime, you don't need a diagnosis to use PDA-informed approaches. The strategies work because they address the underlying need, not the label. So for me, it was actually the school who mentioned the PDA profile. And I want to say something about that because I know a lot of parents have had a very different experience with schools and PDA. And I will come back to that. But in our case, it was the school that said the words. And I went home and I started researching. I found the PDA Society, their YouTube channel specifically, and I watched everything. Every video, every talk, every parent's experience in that very ADHD way of mine, which you'll definitely be learning by now. And something really strikes a chord, and you go down that rabbit hole and you don't come up for air until you've consumed everything that exists on that subject. And what I found was not a list of problems. I found my son. He was described by people who understood him in a way, that language that finally made sense of what I'd been watching for years without being able to name it. And the relief of that, and also the grief of it, because alongside the relief of finally having to find the right words was the weight of all that time I was using the wrong approach. And all the times that we'd pushed harder when actually we should have stepped back, all the times he'd been described as disruptive when actually he was dysregulated, all the times where the tools were wrong because nobody had thought to look at him differently. And he wasn't the problem, it was the wrong lens. And once you change that lens, everything else looks different. Now, just to be completely honest here, because I think hearing this from someone inside of a family rather than a professional, the asking in a direct form is almost always counterproductive with a PDA profile. Not because asking is wrong in principle, but for a child whose nervous system experiences demands as threatening, a direct ask, however warm, however gentle, just triggers that response. And the more directly you ask, the more completely the demand needs to be avoided. So we stopped asking. We stopped saying, go and brush your teeth. We stopped saying, it's time to go to bed. We stopped saying, can you put your shoes on, please? Because please doesn't change the experience of the demand for a PDA child. It just adds social expectation on top of an already threatening request. It just adds a social expectation on top of an already threatening request. So we changed the approach entirely, and oh my gosh, it's so hard. You feel like you are learning to re-parent, and it feels really counterintuitive at first. It felt like we were being manipulated, like we are rewarding avoidance by finding ways around it. But here is what I've definitely come to understand. And this is really, really important, because we weren't rewarding the avoidance. We were removing the trigger that caused it. And I think if you are not a parent in this space, it's really hard to get your head around how difficult it is to get someone to a place that you need to sort of have them in without directly asking them. And that's the difference, and it's really, really significant. And I want to be really clear about something before I talk about any strategies. What works for a PDA child today may not work tomorrow, and that is not a failure. This is the profile. The moment a strategy becomes familiar, the moment the child has figured it out, it stops working because it's no longer novel, because the control has shifted back to the adult. So the goal is never to find the strategy. The goal is to become fluent in the approach so that you can keep generating new strategies as the old ones stop working. It is a creative practice, and it is not a fixed system. Before I share what works for us, I just want to be really, really clear that I am not a PDA specialist. What I am about to share is what works for us right now with our son. And it might not work for your child. PDA is not a one-size approach, not even close. So please do go to the PDA Society for proper guidance. And I'll put their link down in the show notes. Their resources are free and they are far more qualified than I am. But with that said, this is what is working for us right now. This is the teeth brushing story that I told you about in the beginning, and it works because it reframes everything. It's not a demand anymore, it's a competition, it's a game, and my son is curious, driven, with a brilliant sense of humour, and he loves to win. So instead of asking him to do something, I create a situation where doing the thing is how he wins. He doesn't brush his teeth because I've asked him to. He brushes his teeth because he outmaneuvered my prediction, and he is delighted with himself, and so am I. And this is something that I think actually the school have been brilliant with, and I'm genuinely grateful for it, because instead of telling him what to do, they always give him options. Would you like to do this now or in 5 minutes? Would you like to sit here or there? Would you like to use the red pen or the blue pen? The task is the same, the outcome is the same, but he chose it. And that changes everything, really. For a PDA child, imposed consequences can often escalate a situation rather than resolve. So if you don't do this thing now, you are going to lose such and such privilege. That to them feels like a punishment, which feels like control is being taken away, which may trigger the exact response you were trying to address. So natural consequences is the thing actually happens as a result of not doing the thing. That lands very differently. So it's not as a punishment, as information, as cause and effect that exists independently of an adult. And PDA children are often highly logical. They respond to logic in a way they can't respond to authority. So this one, it really took me a while to understand, and I think it's probably one of the most heartbreaking and confusing parts of PDA for parents, actually. So sometimes my son cannot do the things that he actually wants to do. And that's not because he's being defiant. That's not because he's changed his mind or he's shy, but it's because the wanting to do something itself has also become a demand. Let me explain. So it's quite confusing, but a child with PDA profile can sometimes not access their favourite activities. They can't eat their favourite food. They can't watch their favourite programme, even when they asked for it 5 minutes ago, because the moment it became something they should do or are supposed to do, or even something they want to do in a way that now feels like an obligation, their nervous system has turned into a demand, and the demands, including like these internal ones and ones they have placed upon themselves as well, they can trigger the same kind of avoidance response as any external demand. So you might set up exactly what your child has asked for, and they still can't start. They're not being difficult. They're not deliberately winding you up. Their nervous system is experiencing the act of being as a threat, even when what's waiting at the other side is something that they genuinely love. And this is one of the ways that PDA is most profoundly different from other presentations. It's not just about what is asked of them from the outside. It is also about what is asked of them inside too. So if you've ever watched your child refuse or do something that they clearly wanted and felt bewildered and heartbroken at the same time, this is probably what's happening, and naming it changes how you respond, not by pushing, not by incentivizing, by reducing the internal demand, by making the activity feel like a choice that has no stakes, rather than a thing that is happening that must be completed. The would you like to? No pressure, I'll just leave it here, and then actually leaving, not hovering, because we're all probably a little bit guilty of being those hover parents. I know I definitely can be. Not watching, not checking, just remove the audience. And with it, the performance and the pressure, it starts to disappear. new things capture attention as well in a way that routines often can't. In the mornings, like routine feels like, if the morning routine feels like a routine, predictable, repeatable, controllable by the adult, it becomes something to avoid. If it feels new, different, surprising, then there's genuine engagement. This, I have to admit, can be very exhausting to maintain. I won't pretend otherwise, but it's also where the creativity and the curiosity come alive, and that's what makes it worth it. And this is one of the most significant shifts that we made. It was language like, I wonder if anyone could, or it might be that, or no pressure, but it removes the demand directly while still communicating the request. And it sounds strange at first and it feels almost passive, but the effect on a PDA nervous system is significant. The demand is still there, but it's offered as a possibility rather than an expectation. And that difference between possibility and expectation is everything. This one came from a family photo situation. I think a lot of parents might recognise this one. We wanted a family photo, of course, and reasonable request, normal thing, and for most children it is fine. For a child with PDA profile who isn't entirely comfortable in that moment, being asked to stand in a specific place, hold a specific pose, smile on demand, that's a series of demands stacked on top of each other, and the result, if we'd pushed, would have been dysregulation. No photo anyway, and everyone upset. So instead, we now give a choice, not just whether to be in the photo, but whether they want to bring something in the photo, something of his that could be in the photo too, his terms, his contribution, his control over what the photo contained. And then he is in the photo happily on his terms. And that is essentially the principle that we applied to a moment that might seem small but matters enormously, because family memories, they matter, and finding a way for him to be part of them rather than excluded from them by a process that didn't work for his brain is, for us, it's been a worthwhile creative effort. So I also want to talk about something that I think is probably one of the most isolating parts of parenting a PDA child, and that's the perception of others. Because from the outside, from the perspective of someone who doesn't know about PDA, who hasn't read the research, who is watching you navigate a supermarket or a family gathering or a school pickup, what they see can look like a parent giving in constantly to everything. A child who has learned that if they kick up enough fuss, they'll get what they want. And what I want to say to you, and I think this is really important because I have really felt that perception, and whether I have read it correctly or incorrectly, it really doesn't matter. Whether people have actually judged me or whether or not that's just my RSD, I feel it. The looks, the silence that says something, the well-meaning comments about consistency and boundaries, not letting them get away with it. And it is genuinely hard to hold your ground in those moments, to know what you know about your child and still feel the weight of how it looks to someone who doesn't have that context. And here's what I want to say to anyone that's listening that's in that position. You are not giving in. You are choosing your battles, and those are two completely different things. Giving in is abandoning your values because the fight, it got too hard perhaps. Choosing your battles is about making a deliberate and an informed decision about what things actually matter and what things are not worth the dysregulation that enforcing them would cause. And if he is safe, does it matter if he eats his dinner standing up? No, it really doesn't. And the family dinner, where everyone is regulated and present, is infinitely better than a family dinner where one person has been pushed past their limit, and then everyone feels the dysregulation and no one can relax at dinner time. So no, that isn't weakness. That is absolutely wisdom. And it's taken me a long time to find that and the confidence to actually say that as well. I want to share something that I think is, gosh, I feel like I'm sharing everything that is so important. And it really is important because I'm not the only one who went through this. Before we had a PDA profile, before we knew we had any of the right language, I started out with what I thought was a very soft parenting approach, gentle, flexible, instinctively low demand without knowing that's what it was. And it felt right and he was happy and things were manageable. And then when nursery started and the behaviour started and he started being sent home, and honestly, I did what I think a lot of people do when the world tells them that their child's behaviour is a problem. I turned it on myself. I decided that I had been too soft, that I had let him get away with everything, that what he needed now was structure, rules, firm boundaries, and consistent consequences. So I went the opposite way, and it made things, no joke, 10 times worse. Not a little bit worse, 10 times worse. And that was because of what I was doing with all the best intentions, because I genuinely thought I was helping. What I was doing was taking away the one thing that his nervous system needed most, and that was safety and autonomy, the sense that he had some control over his world. And his nervous system responded to that in a way that loss of control in the way that it knew how. And I don't share that to make anyone feel bad, not myself, not any parent who has done exactly the same thing. Because how are we supposed to know? No one told us. The professionals who were seeing us for his behaviour weren't giving us the right lens. And in the absence of the right lens, we used the lenses that we had, the ones that we'd been given. And they're the ones that the world offers by default. We did not know any better. And now we know differently. And that is enough. And we still don't have it all figured out. I want to be clear about that. The goalposts, they do move daily. They sometimes move more often than that as well. And what works today may be completely useless tomorrow, and I have to adapt again and find something new. But my attitude now is different. My question now is not how do I make him comply? My question is he safe? Is he regulated? Is the thing I'm about to push him for actually worth the cost? And if the answer is that he'd rather eat his dinner standing up, genuinely, does that matter if he's eating? He's at the table, he's with his family. To me, that's what matters. So just if you are in this situation, I say this with absolute kindness, please just pick your battles, let the small things go and save your energy for the things that actually count. And above all, be kind to yourself when it's hard, because it is hard. And you are doing so much better than you think from the outside. And like I said earlier, it was the school that mentioned the PDA profile to us first. And I want to give them credit for that, because I think it's really important. They saw something and they named it, and they started making adaptations, and the adaptations have made a real difference. The choices, the flexibility, the understanding that what looks like non-compliance is actually a nervous system that requires a different approach. But I also want to be honest, and not every school gets this. Not every teacher has even heard of PDA. And in those situations where a child with PDA profile encounters an adult who is using a standard toolkit of rewards and consequence, then firm boundaries and the outcomes can be really damaging. Because a PDA child who is pushed too hard, they don't just refuse. They can fall apart and they can shut down. and they can become so dysregulated that learning can become impossible. And then they get described as disruptive, as difficult, as strong-willed. And of course, the cycle then continues. And I think this is why awareness matters so much. This is why talking about PDA matters, because there are children in classrooms right now whose profile hasn't been identified, whose teachers haven't been trained, who are being described in exactly the words my son was described before we had the right lens. And they are not disruptive, they are dysregulated, and there is a difference. So I want to share a few things from research that I think is genuinely important and that don't get talked about enough. PDA children often see themselves as equals to adults. They question authority, but not from a place of defiance, but from a place of genuine equality. They don't understand why age should confer automatic authority and honesty. When you think about it clearly, they have a point. This quality, which gets called disrespectful in school settings, is in a different context called independent thinking, leadership, critical reasoning. PDA children are often highly creative and imaginative, and they will frequently use role play and storytelling and fantasy. Many PDA children are drawn to taking control in that imaginative play as well. They like to direct the narrative, assign roles, control the theme. And this isn't manipulation. It's creativity meeting the need for autonomy in the safest possible space. PDA individuals can find praise as overwhelming as criticism, and that's something to really be aware of. This really does surprise a lot of people, but for a child whose need for autonomy is neurological, praise from an authority figure can feel like another form of external evaluation, another thing being done to them rather than by them. I have seen my son destroy work when we have praised it, not through shame, but from something way more complex than that. And many PDA people describe internal demands, the things they tell themselves they ought to do, as just as difficult to manage as requests from others, which means that conventional advice about helping children to self-motivate, to set their own goals, to use internal reward systems may also not work, but because the I ought to feeling is itself a demand, and demands trigger the response. This is one of the reasons that PDA parenting and teaching requires such constant creativity, because the goal isn't to find the right instruction. The goal is to remove the experience of instruction entirely, to create conditions where the child genuinely chooses to engage, and then gets out of their own way, essentially. When schools reduce the demand and pressure and build in genuine autonomy, PDA students frequently demonstrate strong learning and creative thinking. The barrier to academic achievement is not cognitive capacity, it's anxiety and demand perception. And when those are addressed, when the environment becomes safe enough, the existing capability becomes visible. And that's the whole point. They were always capable, and the environment just wasn't safe enough for them to show it. And I don't want to end this episode in the difficulty, because the difficulty is only part of the story. Actually, I'm crocheting a square for this episode, a square for every person who finds this community. And I think about him all the time when I crochet them, because this community exists in part because of what he's taught me. My son, when he is happy, when he feels safe, when the demands have been removed and the pressure is off, and one of the most joyful and engaged, curious human beings I have ever spent time with. He loves learning, not in a structured, sit down and be taught kind of way, but in an alive, questioning, following the thread way. He'll latch onto something that interests him, and he'll go deeper than you think possible for his age. He notices things, he makes connections, he asks questions that make me stop. He makes his siblings laugh, he makes his friends laugh. His sense of humour is so sharp and quick and completely his own that when he's comfortable, when he's in a space where he feels safe to be exactly who he is, he absolutely lights up, and everyone around him lights up with him. The freedom that he feels when he's comfortable is something that I have thought about so much, because I think it points to something really important. The demand avoidance, the need for control, those aren't who he is. Those are his nervous system's response to a world that asks too much without offering enough safety. And when the world offers safety, when we remove unnecessary demands, when we give him choices, when we let him win the teeth brushing game, what's left isn't a child that avoids, it's a child who engages fully, joyfully, and completely. And that's who he is. And it's my job, our job as the adults around him and others, to create the conditions where that version can show up. It's not to fix them, it's not to make them comply, it's to create safety, and that's it, that's the whole job. So if you are a parent who has been told that your child is stubborn, strong-willed, manipulative, probably the list may be way longer than that. I'm sure I've missed out so many. I want you to hear this. So those questions, they aren't actually wrong about what your child is doing, but they are so wrong about why. And it's the why that matters more than anything else, because when you understand the why, you stop trying to push harder, and you stop asking and you start asking a completely different question. Not how do I get my child to comply, but what does my child need to feel safe enough to engage? And that question, it changes everything. And if you're a practitioner, a teacher, a TA, a professional of any kind who is reading or listening to this, the PDA profile is real. And it's in your classrooms, and the standard toolkit, it won't work. And I say this without anger, I say it because it matters, because there are children whose lives could be significantly different if the adults around them had a different set of tools. The PDA Society is by far the best place to start. Their resources, they're accessible, practical, and written for exactly this purpose. I'll put the link in the show notes. Go gently, go curiously, and if a strategy stops working, that's not a failure, that's just a Thursday. So try something new tomorrow.